Well, should we slowly set to, or should we give it another?
I would start now. It's 2 minutes past.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think this is terribly exciting. I'm Tom Ramsden, and I'm chairman of the Yorkshire Historic Churches Trust. And I'm just praying that the technology doesn't come to bits, and we find this whole thing falls apart. But the exciting thing is that we're all gathered remotely to listen to Kate. What we're going to do is ask Kate to lecture, and then at the end we'll have some questions. And you might like to ask Kate questions. And I think if you click on your chat button at the bottom of the screen, you should then be able to type a question. And Wara is going to host the question session after Kate's been lecturing. Kate is the senior lecturer in the Department of Archaeology at York University. And she's also co-director of the University of York Centre for the Study of Christianity and Culture. She's one of our trustees. We're thrilled to have her as a trustee. And she's particularly keen to see her students involved with heritage and with church architecture and its value and its meaning to us all. And I think this would be a wonderful addition to the work of the Trust if we could find students involved with what we're doing. Because to get the youth and young people involved with this, I think would be a remarkable thing. But anyway, I'm not going to chat on. I'm going to hand over to Kate, who's going to tell us about the medieval paintings in Pickering Church. Kate.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you for your warm welcome. And thank you to all the trustees and members for such a warm welcome to the Society. Vanessa, am I now the host?
Yes, you are.
Lovely. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the moment of truth where I share my screen and you tell me whether you can see my screen. And let me just...
Yes.
That's wonderful. And I'll just start from the beginning. Lovely. So I thought I would start this evening's lecture with a quotation from, I'm sure, one of our favourite scholars, commentators on historic churches, Nicholas Pevsner. And this quotation about Pickering is absolutely classic Pevsner. On the one hand, noting the wonders of Pickering as an example of one of the most complete sets of medieval church wall paintings, giving us a sense of what the medieval church must really have been like. And then noting that these paintings were ruthlessly restored in the 1880s. And in any case, since they had never been great art, it is probably better to see them today clearly than to see the original brushwork dimly. Now, perhaps we have members of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings here who might disagree with Pevsner. But what I hope to do this evening is to persuade you that Pickering really is an architectural gem and that there is far more to its story that might be of interest to the Society's members and indeed, I hope, to the wider public. In one sense, Pickering is an every church. It's a church that I love to use as an example of architectural history with my students when we visit. It has early traces of an Anglo-Saxon foundation, mostly contained today in a rather bizarre buttress rebuilt in the 1960s at the corner of the church porch and in its surviving Anglo-Saxon font bowl. But I hope you can see on the right-hand side of the slide here that we have arcades dating to the mid to late 12th century scallop capitals. And as we move forward in time over the Middle Ages, we have some major additions to the church, which tell us so eloquently about the obsession in the late medieval church with the doctrine of purgatory and the desire by wealthy families like the Bruces and the Rawcliffes to found their own chantry chapels. We're fortunate that the Rawcliffe Chantry Chapel still survives in the church today with its wonderful alabaster effigies. But poor old Sir Bruce has been rather unceremoniously dumped by the corner of the chancel arch, his chapel long lost even by the time 18th century antiquarians visited, but now the site of the organ chamber of the 19th century. So these foundations tell us about aristocratic patronage, perhaps, to Pickering. But for me, churches start to become really interesting in the 15th century, when wealthy merchants and, of course, the members of medieval guilds begin to invest in them on a large scale. And Pickering, again, is an eloquent example of this kind of investment. We have, as I'm sure you can see here, a clerestory added in the 15th century, providing a great mural canvas for the scheme of paintings which was to follow. The nave walls and the church porch are embattled at this time, and the porch probably dates to a not dissimilar period, late 14th or early 15th century. And of course, this was one of the most popular places to be buried, as people stepped over your mortal remains and were reminded to pray for your soul. This was probably a period too when the church tower was expanded. We know that there were early bells in the tower itself, and traces of patronage of the Duchy of Lancaster, who are the manorial lords of Pickering, creating a tension throughout the Middle Ages for the residents of Pickering, who were required regularly to serve the House of Lancaster, march on York, and defend people that they probably felt were their mortal enemies, since they were located across the Pennines. We'll come back to the Wars of the Roses and the symbolism of the paintings slightly later on. But I want to take you forward to August 1852 and to a series of remarkable letters which survive in the vestry of the parish church still today. They are an exchange of correspondence between the Reverend of the time, the Reverend John Ponsonby. He's a little bit of the villain of my piece, so I hope nobody here is related to him, and the then Archbishop of York, Thomas Musgrave. You can see that, in common with many churches in the period, in the 1850s, the church was undergoing restoration work. And the Reverend Ponsonby writes to Musgrave to appeal for advice in order to avoid any unpleasant collision, as he describes it, between his parishioners on the one part and himself on the other. During the course of these works, images, figures on the wall have come to light, and Ponsonby describes them as works of art being purely ridiculous and yet attracting great curiosity amongst local tourists who flocked to Pickering, and now there is a party in his parish who want them permanently exposed to view. He feels this is completely inappropriate, not just because they are not great art, but also because they would excite feelings of curiosity and distract the attention of his congregation, presumably from Ponsonby's deathly dull sermons. But also, as he notes here, because the paintings are out of place in a Protestant church, especially in these dangerous days. So how do we make sense of this correspondence and what was happening as these paintings came to light? Well, Ponsonby was an incumbent in his 70s, widowed, living in the churchyard in the former parsonage house with his unmarried daughter. And it's fair to say from the correspondence to the York Herald that he was not universally popular. Here is the anonymous correspondent Rusticus complaining that the vicar held himself aloof from parish affairs and had recently refused to support the foundation of a mechanics institute in Pickering, buttoning up his pockets and turning away. This despite the fact that he was paid the handsome sum of £300 a year and had a curate, but kept the church locked and only delivered a single sermon a week. Now, as the paintings were discovered, antiquarians were drawn to Pickering, both from York and further afield, particularly from London. We have a wonderful account from the Yorkshire Architectural Society by William Haydykes, who was the consulting architect to Durham Cathedral. His end is a sad one, I'm afraid. He fell through the ice on the River Ouse and died of pneumonia several days later. But thankfully, long after, he had described the remarkable paintings at Pickering in a written paper delivered to the Society. And that paper, published in some of the early publications of the Associated Architectural Societies, was read and accompanied by a series of paintings created by the Society's artist, with Mr. William Bevan. Sadly, as we'll see later on, those original paintings do not seem to have survived, but nevertheless, these two things together brought brought the value of these paintings to light. It's possible that they were borrowed by the Royal Archaeological Institute in London because Mr. Spencer Hall, the librarian of the Athenaeum Club, also visited Pickering and read a paper at the proceedings of the Archaeological Institute, accompanied by some illustrations. But Ponsonby had not been idle. His unhappiness with the paintings had encouraged him, or perhaps I probably think his unfortunate curate, to have been sent up a ladder to begin mutilating the paintings. And Haydykes notes that particular attention had been paid to the crucifix on the altar above Becket's shrine, or sorry, above Becket's altar. And we'll come back to Becket later. There was a lot of correspondence in the local papers about the discovery of the paintings, including traces of other paintings which were said to have been wantonly destroyed by Ponsonby, presumably hoping that nobody would notice. And Mr. Frank Howard, who was a local celebrity artist, gave extensive thoughts on this in the York Herald newspaper. He also noted that he had been invited to go and see the paintings by the two church wardens, Mr. Windle and Mr. Parkinson, who, perhaps with an eye on the tourist trade and boost to their local businesses, were also very much in favour of the paintings being preserved. And indeed, that was also the view of Archbishop Musgrave, who was president of the Yorkshire Architectural Society. In his correspondence with Ponsonby, he noted that, of course, one would not dream of creating these kinds of paintings in a church in the 1850s, but as relics of antiquity, there was no need to obliterate them, or at all events, not at least until they had been copied by some skillful and competent artist. Fateful words, as it turned out. Because the Reverend John Ponsonby, as you can see from his letter back to the Archbishop, was not to be dissuaded by episcopal instructions. He reflects on how the paintings inspire leanings towards Romish heresy, and how could one possibly preach in the church reflecting on the fate of the martyred Cranmer and the sainted Jewel, when having these things in a church was a willful violation of God's word. But he also, in the middle paragraph of this letter, refers to a party in the church who viewed the Reformation as a limb badly set. And of course here, Ponsonby is referring both to the Oxford movement and the Cambridge Camden Society, the ecclesiologists who were looking back at the medieval church as a source both of liturgical inspiration, but of course architectural and artistic inspiration too. Well, despite what the Archbishop instructed, Ponsonby had his way. The paintings were completely destroyed and disappeared from view for another 20 years. Now, this is the health warning part of my lecture, where I warn you that you're about to hear some dreadful scandal, admittedly Victorian scandal. This is the Reverend George Alexander Coburn, somehow related to Dean Coburn of York Minster. And he arrived in Pickering after the death of John Ponsonby. Initially, he was a very popular vicar. He founds a library in the front parlour of the widow of the sexton and her daughter, Jane or Jenny Wardell, who is then 26. Coburn is waiting for the vicarage to be upgraded, for his family to arrive and join him from Belgium. But in the meantime, he makes himself very popular in Pickering. But gradually it's noted that he's spending more and more time in the front parlour, and indeed the back parlour of Jenny Wardell's house. The elderly Mrs. Wardell passes away. Apprentices gather on the steps of the parish churchyard, making the sound of a goat as the Reverend Coburn walks past. And local craftsmen watching by candlelight see inappropriate embraces happening in the back parlour. Matters come to a head on the day of the mustering of the militia in Scarborough, where Jenny has invited the Reverend Coburn in his militia uniform to go to a photographer's studio on the Scarborough seafront, and this is the photograph that is taken. Coburn asks the photographer to destroy the negative, but he doesn't. The couple miss their train and end up on the platform at Malton, where there's more gossip circulating. And the middle class residents of Pickering, who are also waiting for the train, begin to get fed up with the gossip and scandal that is following Coburn around. Finally, he is seen to rearrange Jenny Wardell's crinoline inappropriately in the carriage, and matters then come to the form of a letter which is written to the Archdeacon, and Coburn is suspended. And this story has been beautifully researched and told by my colleague from the University of York, Ted Royal. I won't spoil the end of the story, but I'm really surprised nobody has made a film out of it. And there is a kind of denouement at the end of the story. But Coburn's suspension means that we have another character entering our story. And here is our hero, the Reverend George Herbert Lightfoot. Lightfoot can only be curate in charge until the Reverend Coburn actually dies. But what a difference he makes when he arrives in Pickering. The church has been almost deserted by the worthy citizens who are so scandalised by Coburn's behaviour. And Lightfoot, who I'm sure was an ecclesiologist at heart, decides to restore both the church and his congregation together. He brings in leading architectural advisors to rebuild and restore the tower of the church, which is in imminent danger of collapse. And you can see a surviving photograph of that work here. But he also restores the church along the lines of ecclesiology, working with the church commissioners to reinstate the steps and hierarchy of the East End, rebuilding the transepts in a spirit of ecclesiological improvement that we might balk at today, but also, and importantly for the citizens of Pickering, repewing the church almost entirely, getting rid of appropriated pews and opening up the church to larger numbers of the parish. Now, as that restoration comes to an end, and it turns out that Lightfoot must have raised over £9,000 in the 1870s for the restoration, so no small sum. He's being told about the wonderful story of the discovery of the paintings. And in a later article published in 1895 in the Yorkshire Archaeological Journal, he describes that desire to bring the paintings to light once again. He works with the firm of Shrigley and Hunt, not quite Clayton and Bell in terms of their kind of artistic work, but not far off. And they have been involved in the creation of new stained glass windows in the north transept of the church in particular. And their artist, Mr. Edward Holmes Jewett, is the third generation of a family of great engravers and antiquarian illustrators from Sheffield. And you may know the work of Orlando Jewett, who worked, of course, with Gough on his Sepulchral Monuments volume. Jewett and Lightfoot initially reveal the paintings, and they try to protect them under some kind of medium, perhaps the sort of turpentine and beeswax recipe that was being then recommended by Professor Church. That recipe was published in one of the first great studies or lists of wall paintings we have published by Charles Keyser in 1883. And so one of the reasons why Lightfoot's restoration is so significant is that it happens at just the moment when the systematic and scholarly study of wall paintings by the V&A Museum and other scholars is really taking off. Now, it's important to remind ourselves of just how much things have changed. In the 30 years since the first discovery of the paintings and Musgrave's reassurance to the Reverend Ponsonby that we would never dream of repainting a church with wall paintings today. Here, of course, is Garshin on the walls with the wonderful Clayton and Bell paintings covering almost every surface of this church with exquisite Victorian artwork. So by the 1880s, the perception and reception of medieval ecclesiastical artworks and wall paintings had changed considerably. My question as an archaeologist was really then, what could I tell about the preservation of the paintings in the 1880s and how that related to what had been visible in 1852? What did Jewett add? And what has been done to the paintings since then to conserve and restore them? And is it possible to say anything about their original medieval meanings and quality of artwork? Well, I knew that in the 1980s, a very important project by the Courtauld Institute had recorded the presence of a series of drawings on display in the parish church tower, but those drawings appeared to have disappeared. All I could locate at the time was this copy of a series of drawings made in 1931 by C.J. Norton for an article in the Yorkshire Archaeological Journal by John Lamplugh Kirk. Now, many of you may be familiar with Kirk, who was a popular local doctor, and of course his collections became the foundation for the Castle Museum. He looked for the early drawings of the paintings made in 1852, and he was supported in this endeavour by Dr Evelyn, one of the great members of the Yorkshire Architectural and Archaeological Society, but they couldn't locate them anywhere. But they did produce this illustration in the journal, and after some searching around, lo and behold, behind the vestry cupboard, we did discover this series of 9 beautiful watercolour images. So we knew that these were copied in 1931, and the parish very kindly let us take these to a local framers in Helmsley, where we were able to establish that these had been made for a gentleman called William Watson, who became a church warden later in Pickering. And I was able just to find the name of the artist on the neck of the dragon, just in the corner of the neck of the dragon here, and trace that artist through the census records to Scarborough. And then through the newspaper records, I was able to discover that he had made these drawings for the reading of a paper to the Scarborough Archaeological Society in 1852. So for me, this was a real discovery. It meant that here we had an accurate record of what was visible in 1852, which we could compare then with the surviving paintings to see what was added by Jewett in the 1880s. There are a series of other major drawings of significance held, for example, by the Victoria and Albert Museum. These were made, these are watercolour drawings by Professor Ernest William Tristram, often thought to be the first major scholar of wall paintings, co-curator of the Great British Primitives exhibition at the Royal Academy in 1923. And his drawings were considered to be so significant, so important, they formed the focus of an entire exhibition at the Leeds City Art Gallery in 1933. Although it was noted with disappointment that there were none of the drawings of Pickering on display at that gallery exhibition. Now, we know that Tristram made these drawings in 1915 when he was a student of W.R. Letherby at the Royal College of Art. And so it's intriguing, given that they were published in his catalogue of the Royal Academy exhibition, why he did not include them in what would have, you would have thought would have been a very popular subject for a Yorkshire audience. And my suspicion is that Tristram was already very well aware that these were largely Victorian restorations, and so was reluctant to bring them to the Leeds exhibition. He had been invited in the 1930s by the vicar to come and advise and then conserve the paintings, which evidently by the 30s were suffering badly from further decay. And his assistant, Mobley, waxed and preserved the paintings once again. Unfortunately, we do now know that Tristram's methods of preservation, using again this kind of turpentine and beeswax method, were equally disastrous as Professor Church's recipe of the 1880s. And it wasn't until Clive Rouse arrived in Pickering in the 1960s that attempts were made to remove some of that wax and preservative covering. Now, I'm very grateful to Tom Callaghan, a former student from the Institute of Advanced Architectural Studies in York, way back in the 1970s, who sent me an email from Kazakhstan to invite me to explore the collections of the church's safety deposit box in my quest for the 1852 drawings. I contacted the vicar, of course, and asked him what was in his safety deposit box. And Anthony said, well, we don't have a safety deposit box. And it was at that point that the church wardens pointed out that since he'd only been there for 5 years, they hadn't bothered telling him about the church's safety deposit box. So we rushed around the corner to the local solicitors. We opened up these incredible rolls of drawings to discover these beautiful drawings made by Janet Lenton, one of Clive Rouse's assistants. They're actually, most of them are rolls of anaglypta wallpaper. And these scale drawings were made by Janet during the restoration of the paintings by Rouse in the early 60s. So it's another remarkable set of drawings we have surviving of the condition of these paintings. they had, particularly this image of St. Christopher, had suffered very badly in the 1947 winter when water and snow had come down the church walls. And this is one of the very rare cases where Rouse himself repainted almost the entirety of the St. Christopher image and felt that was justified on the basis of the extensive Victorian repainting prior to his intervention. So what did Jewett add to these paintings in the 1880s? Well, I've just got a series of images here to show you the comparison. This is what on the left-hand side was visible in 1852, and this is what Jewett evidently repainted. So although we can see that this evidently is St. George and the Dragon, there's quite a lot of the detail of the armour, of the horse, and indeed of the dragon itself that was added in by Jewett. And my good colleagues from the Leeds Royal Armouries tell me that there was never a medieval knight's helmet that looked quite like a duck-billed platypus in their experience of artistic representations. Similarly, we can see how Jewett added here to this image of a cartoon of the story of St. John the Baptist, particularly an area on the bottom left-hand side which had been obscured or destroyed by a funerary monument. You might just be able to see, I don't know whether you can see my mouse, but the outline of that monument there with Salome standing with a rather gruesome kind of image, presumably of the beheading of St. John the Baptist that Jewett has reconstructed for our entertainment. And this is particularly apparent in the lower portion of the martyrdom of St. Edmund. So you see here that we have St. Edmund bound to a tree being shot with arrows, and we're told it's St. Edmund by the black letter inscription on the image. But if you look closely, particularly at the lower part of the archer, here, you'll see it's very pre-Raphaelite in its sensibilities. And we know that Jewett probably trained with the pre-Raphaelites in London. So here he's bringing kind of his own artistic sensibility to the restoration of the paintings. And we might debate in questions whether that's a good or a bad thing. And then finally, I'm showing you the bottom image of St. Catherine. And this is a fantastic discovery, again, from closely rereading Lightfoot's confessional piece in the Yorkshire Archaeological Journal. The bottom part of this scene, which is the martyrdom of Catherine, as told, for example, in the Golden Legend, that great sort of medieval storybook of saints, had again been destroyed by a funerary monument. But the image that Lightfoot has chosen to show us is Maxentius, the emperor, extending his hand to spare St. Catherine from being beheaded. And I now know which copy of the Story of the Saints Lightfoot had in his library, and he has used that to change the ending of St. Catherine's story, which I can't help but feel probably in the medieval image would have been a lot more grisly than this. So we also know that we've lost paintings. Lightfoot himself tells us that in the great underpinning and reconstruction of the tower, a St. Michael weighing the souls was lost from the west tower wall. And you can see today that that is largely a bare wall, no surface plaster there. We also know that in the north transept, there was a painting described as a doom. I'm not entirely convinced by that. I think there may have been another iconography. Both of these paintings were said to be superior in the quality of their artwork to the 15th century paintings. So it's possible that, as in many churches, we had layer upon layer of paintings here. And you'll also note that we have some blank areas of wall plaster, both at the western and at the eastern end of the nave. And we don't know what was visible, what is visible, what still lies behind those areas of plaster. As far as we can tell, they were not explored in the 19th century. Another intriguing reference comes from a newspaper article, which initially I just dismissed as a kind of error of reporting, which described a Last Supper painting on the north wall of the chancel. Now, we know that the organ chamber here was inserted in the 19th century by the church commissioners. Ewan Christian was their architect, of course, working here as elsewhere. But I'm intrigued by the fact that opposite the site of this supposed painting is a window dedicated to one of those worthy Pickering solicitors, one of the Mitchelson mafia. And indeed, it depicts the Last Supper. So I can't help but wonder whether this is a little bit of a reference to that lost painting, perhaps a sense of guilt by Lightfoot that he couldn't save it as part of the restoration project. So what can we say about having stripped away these kind of later alterations, and we've seen that there are extensive additions aesthetically and in terms of areas of the scenes here. What can we say about the original medieval cycle? And I'm going to think about the iconography of that, starting on the north wall, moving from west to east, and then turning our attention to the south wall from east to west. Well, first of all, we have what we might expect in a series of 15th century medieval church wall paintings, images of very popular saints who were the subjects for intercessory prayers and were very popular patrons of the day. A very common juxtaposition at the western end of St. George and the Dragon and St. Christopher, both of them, George obviously patron saint, but both of them associated with the belief that if you saw an image of them during the day, you would be protected from dying an unshriven death. And I find it fascinating that as you look through the porch, that doorway into Pickering Church, you have framed perfectly for you an image of those two saints. I like to think of Pickering's medieval merchants heading down the dangerous A64, just kind of peeking a glimpse of St. Christopher and St. George, confident in the knowledge that they would at least not die unshriven if they were encountered a misfortune during the day. We have then our cartoon of St. John the Baptist. It starts on the right-hand side, and there we have St. John rebuking the Emperor Herod and his bigamous marriage to his brother's wife Herodias. Just at St. John's feet, we have Salome kind of disco dancing on the floor here. And the narrative, as we've seen, then shifts to the left where we have the beheading of the saint, and then back to the central scene where the head of the saint is presented by Salome on a charger to her parents. I don't know whether you're able to see, but just behind Salome's head, there's a knife blade here, and it's being held by her mother. And this relates to the story of the relic of the head of St. John the Baptist, which of course was in a church in the south of France, and it had a very prominent scar in its forehead. And those lovely little alabaster heads that we get as St. John the Baptist kind of devotive objects surviving, for example, in the Yorkshire Museum, they have that kind of scar in the centre of the head. So it's a really nice kind of reference to the ways in which these artworks spoke to other forms of devotional object at the time. At the eastern end of the north wall, we have the juxtaposition of Becket and below him St. Edmund. And Becket is interesting because obviously he's a very popular saint in this period. And I think lurking on Zoom somewhere, we have John Jenkins, who I hesitate to say anything about Becket in front of, because he's our resident expert on Becket, who's been reconstructing his shrine at Canterbury. But what is interesting to me here is that the depiction of the martyrdom of Becket evidently precedes the widespread publication of Caxton's edition of the Golden Legend, in which the martyrdom shows the four soldiers, the four knights, stabbing the saint, and there's sort of blood everywhere. And in a project I'm working on in Stratford-on-Avon, where we know Caxton's Golden Legend was being used, that's the depiction of the iconography. My colleagues at the Leeds Armouries have now given me very useful information about some of the specific details of the armour here, which we know from the 1852 drawings was very well preserved. And this has allowed us to redate these paintings, not to 1850, which was, not to 1450, which was the original date, but rather to the third quarter, of the 15th century. And that's very interesting because, of course, this places the creation of this cycle of paintings at a very problematic time for the Duchy of Lancaster and the House of York, and therefore for the residents of Pickering. So perhaps it's not surprising that they juxtaposed Edward's favourite saint, Becket, with Henry VI's favourite saint, St. Edmund, below. And I do wonder whether these proxy saints are speaking to something of the petitions that the residents of Pickering regularly made about how they felt caught or torn between these two loyalties. Edmund is also interesting here in that we have extensive black letter inscription associated with his image. You can see on the right-hand side in Middle English, heavenly blessed who has made, hem shall have for has good dade. So this is a reminder that the audience for these paintings are not an illiterate, isolated northern laity. They are literate, probably owners of books of hours, copies of the Golden Legend. They would have been familiar with the stories of the saints, as would their clergy, using Merck's Festial and other sources as sources for sermon exemplar. Now, across the North Wall, then, we have this amazing panoply of male saints, all martyred for their faith. And I like to think that it didn't matter what kind of chap you were in Pickering in the 15th century, a military man, perhaps a gigantic sort of farm labourer, an ascetic cleric, local aristocracy, you would have been able to find a male saint on the north wall of Pickering Parish Church who could have been your pin-up poster saint, who you could have prayed for to intervene in your daily life. And if you were a woman in 15th century Pickering, you had the best saint of them all. Of course, I would say this being Catherine. This is the knowledgeable Christian, Catherine. And I can't help but feel that there must have been a guild dedicated to her in Pickering, although it's not recorded, or somebody who paid for this series of paintings who was called Catherine. We have a whole series of cartoons related to her life here, from the upper top hand scene where she is rebuking Maxentius's court for the worship of an idol, to scenes of imprisonment, a wonderful scene in the middle here where she debates with the philosophers, a very extensive set of black letter inscription originally there, sadly undecipherable in the 19th century, the famous image of her being tortured on the wheels, and then finally her martyrdom. And although I'm not entirely convinced by hypotheses that medieval parish churches saw strict segregation of laity along gender lines, with men regularly being said to stand on the south side of the church and women on the north, if women were standing on the north and men on the south, they certainly would have had a good view of these kind of gendered saintly images appealing to them. That theme of the knowledgeable Christian is then perpetuated across the rest of the South Wall in scenes which would have been familiar to parishioners during their Lenten catechism. For example, here, the corporal acts of mercy prompts to remind you what were the alternatives to the 7 deadly sins. So obviously this is from Matthew chapter 25, the exhortation to a good Christian to give drink to the thirsty, feed the hungry, shelter the stranger, clothe the naked, visit the imprisoned, visit the sick, and finally, with the shrouded corpse in the grave, to bury the dead. Those scenes are followed by another cartoon of scenes from the Passion, Crucifixion, Resurrection, and then, as you see in the bottom left-hand side here, the harrowing of hell. And once again, these speak to an Easter story, perhaps again elements of the catechism, the testing of parishioners during their sort of Lenten reflections about their knowledge of the salving grace of Christ, manifested particularly, of course, in the harrowing of hell, where all those who have died without knowledge of his saving grace are led out of hell. And the first person to be greeted is Adam holding the apple. Above those images on the south wall, we have these 3 scenes, initially thought to be the death, the funeral, and the Assumption of the Virgin. Now, the central scene is clearly the funeral of the Virgin, as depicted or described in the Apocrypha, where the Jew Belzereh jumps onto the coffin and is stuck fast. I think the image to the left, the Assumption, we have a series of angels and a possible girdle or belt kind of thrown down by the Virgin here. This was thought to be the right-hand side image, the deathbed scene of the Virgin, but there's not much room in the upper part of the scene. It's certainly the apostles gathering around something, and we'll come back to that in a little moment. But these scenes culminate on the north wall with the coronation of the Virgin. So we have the Trinity, apostles and saints surrounding the Virgin, and then above them the sort of heavenly battlements with figures crowding over the top, depicting the residents of the heavenly Jerusalem. Now, some of these are angels, but some of them seem very, very secular, and there are traces of these figures recorded in 1852, although quite a few of them are from Jewett's imagination. I can't help but think that some of these might have been Pickering's wealthy citizens who paid for the paintings and wanted themselves depicted in their latest fashionable headgear in the painting scheme. And thanks to the work of Janet Lenton in her painstaking recording in the 1950s, we can also, I think, quite confidently say that the image here, thought to be the funeral, the deathbed scene of the Virgin, is probably the culmination of Christ's passion in the ascension of Christ. And Miss Lenton uncovered, I hope you can see in the image here, a foot rising heavenward in that upper scene. So I think there we have that culmination of the ascension of Christ and the passion story. So what are the sources and meanings of these paintings? Well, I think it's important to remind ourselves of the rich and, as I've said, literate culture in which these paintings were created towards the end of the 15th century, not just sources like the Golden Legend or John Merck's instructions for parish priests, but also from a Yorkshire perspective, initiatives such as Thoresby's Lay Folks Catechism. These sources were manifested in a whole variety of ways in artistic patronage in the parish church, but also in books of hours. We see here a calendar from a book of hours, and this is a reminder of the ways in which the laity were very actively involved in the marking out of liturgical time, marking the Sanctorale, the fixed feasts of the saints, alongside those movable feasts such as Easter. And sources like the Golden Legend, of course, organise the stories of saints into the liturgical year, starting usually in Advent, although some of the other sources of the time, such as the South English Legendary, prefer to start their liturgical calendars with Candlemas. And of course, we should remind ourselves that the old regnal year started on the 25th of March. Now, these markings out of saints' festivals and times are not just important in setting the wider context for the paintings, but also the paintings themselves. Because when we look at the location of the paintings in the context of the architectural framework of the church and the bay rhythm as it unfolds from west to east, something truly remarkable emerges. So starting at the West End, we have St George, whose feast date falls in April. Opposite those images associated with Easter, the movable feast, of course, falling between March and April, giving way to an image of St Christopher in July. And we have traces in the clerestory windows, probably of St Anne teaching the Virgin to read, and St Anne's feast is also July. Then those images associated with the funeral, the Assumption and coronation of the Virgin, associated with August, and then giving way towards, and over those set over St John the Baptist, whose decollation feast is also the 29th of August, and finally at the eastern end, St Edmund and St Catherine, whose feast dates fall in November, and Becket in December. So March, April, July, August, September, November, December, those feasts unfold with the time and space of the parish church itself. So what on earth does that mean? And despite having finished my book on Pickering, I still don't really know. There are two possibilities that occur to me. We know that from the Chantry Commissioners in the 1540s that there was a guild in Pickering, which was still in existence at that time, dedicated to the Virgin, and therefore it's not surprising that we have such a proliferation of images dedicated to her. Its priest, Richard Judson, known as the Lady Priest, was still in employment at that time, and the goods of the guild were surrendered to the Duchy of Lancaster in 1548. So perhaps this building project, the addition of the clerestory and the creation of the painted scheme, was led by the Guild of the Virgin. But it's also likely that other parochial groups were involved in it. And perhaps, as I've suggested, there was a particular guild or service dedicated to St Catherine as well. So I think this kind of design by committee is important when we look at these quotations from some of the leading scholars on wall paintings. They're rather dismissive of 15th century schemes of paintings, describing them, as Paul Binsky puts it, as random collections of popular saints, with little thought given to their overall meaning. And Pamela Tudor Craig, who noted that even at Pickering, there's no coherent sequence in the paintings. But I hope I've just showed you in that plan form that there is indeed a very coherent sequence, something that tells us of the marking out of liturgical and festival time. Perhaps the artist for these paintings simply had a copy of the Golden Legend and flicked through it looking for everybody's popular saints, and then put a list together, and they worked from west to east. Perhaps the residents of Pickering had that kind of source themselves. We'll never know. But I think that there is something remarkable about that sequence in Pickering itself, telling us about the ways in which liturgical time was marked out, associated with statues, candles, festival of activities. And that, to me, is raising the significance of Pickering way above and beyond that of these sort of random arrays of incoherent schemes of painting that previous scholars have assumed they were. So what do we do with this kind of knowledge? You are all passionate about the history and heritage of these wonderful buildings on our doorstep. And one of the fantastic things about working for a university today is that the university is firmly committed to us putting our knowledge and research into practice. Thomas kindly mentioned that I work with the Centre for the Study of Christianity and Culture, and we work with many parish churches, helping advise them on lottery projects or reordering projects, but also bringing their stories to life. This is the Reverend Anthony Pritchett, who has recently retired from Pickering. We have a new vicar who's just come in, and he and I worked together on a Heritage Lottery Stage 1 project a few years ago. It was incredibly ambitious. £2 million was all we were asking for. And sadly, we were not successful in our project, but thanks to his energies and efforts and the support of the local community who really got behind us on the project, they have now undertaken the major works to the church, the underfloor heating, the new lighting scheme, which means that we hope with the new incumbent, we can go back to the lottery. Now it is finally open again, and make a new pitch for the cleaning and the conservation of the paintings and tell their story. As archaeologists at the University of York, we can use the latest digital recording techniques to document the paintings in their current conservation condition and to zoom right in and look at what needs doing to them, working closely with our conservator, Tobit Curtis, who is one of the leading experts on wall paintings, and I'm sure many of you know his exemplary work. But I'm also interested, as I hope you'll have gathered during the course of this lecture, in telling this amazing story of grumpy vicars, heroic vicars, layers of restoration and conservation, which really bring this church to light. So I want to end with my final chapter in the story and recommend that you read a book as inspiration for visiting Pickering in lockdown until we can meet there again. This is the wonderful J.L. Carr's A Month in the Country. I'm sure many of you know it. It's an evocation of late summer in North Yorkshire and of a shell-shocked First World War soldier who is sent to uncover a doom painting in a North Yorkshire country parish church. And I've given you an illustration here of my doom painting in Stratford-on-Avon just to give you the illustrative effect. The soldier, Birkin, falls in love with the vicar's wife. The vicar is very grumpy and worried that the paintings are going to distract the congregation from his sermons. And I can't help but think that J.L. Carr, who grew up, of course, near Thirsk, knew something of the Pickering story and wove it into this beautiful book. And if you need any more encouragement to read the book, I recommend the film to you. It was filmed in the 1980s, and the wall painting conservator is played by the amazing Colin Firth in one of his first film roles. And the archaeologist excavating in the churchyard, so there's a detective story kind of going on at the same time, is played by Kenneth Branagh, again in one of his first film roles. So I want to leave you there with a quotation from A Month in the Country, which to me sums up how I feel about Pickering, having spent the last 10 years or so thinking about this building and finally finished my book on it. I want to evoke that moment when we come out of lockdown and stand in Pickering together with Moira, with a gin and tonic, I definitely hope, and look at these wonderful paintings and share their understanding, not just with each other as fans of these wonderful buildings, but also with the wider public, who are the people, the generations who will care for them in time to come. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. I think if you have used Zoom before, you may be a Zoom aficionado. There's a chat function at the bottom of your screen, and you can post. You'll have seen Valerie and Barbara English and Valerie Black. I've said hello to you in the chat. Hopefully everyone can see those messages. So post a question in there if you'd like, or make a comment, and we'll try and field the questions coming in.
Kate, that was simply wonderful. Moira, do you want to, I mean, people might be able to ask questions, or do you think it will be chaotic? We could try it.
At the moment, we've just got two things on chat. And one is Kate to everybody, and then the other one is Sue to saying thank you, a great lecture, which I think we can all say as well. So there might be some people who want to, if anybody wants to make a comment, we can probably manage it.
Yes, feel free to unmute and shout, and then
yes,
you should
unmute and shout if there are any queries.
Unless you're Jane's Beagle, which I gather is behaving badly.
Well, behaving naturally, I think.
I can see Veronica waving. I can see Veronica waving.
Yes, there's one. There's Colin Roberts up there. Colin.
Yes. Do we know whether the 19th century restorers of these works of art tried to use the earth tints and, as it were, primitive colorings that were used in the medieval times, or did they try to improve them with the more modern manufactured colors?
What a great question, Colin. And the answer is we don't know.
Oh.
We haven't sampled the pigments, but that is exactly what Tobit would want to do in order to know what to do with them. Obviously, by the time Clive Rouse was restoring things in the 50s and 60s, I'm pretty confident that's what he would have been doing. Alas, I fear, in the true spirit of ecclesiology, there was some improvement going on in the 1880s. And I suspect that desire for kind of liveliness and colour led to Jewett probably using some inappropriate pigments, but having a better understanding of what's there and what we can do with it. They were already this terrible recipe of turpentine and beeswax that Church recommended. We know that even by 1902, the paintings, that thick, sticky surface was attracting lots of dirt and dust. And one of the disadvantages of the new lighting scheme is it's showing that dirt and dust up beautifully for us now. So we would want to very carefully clean the paintings just with deionized water. It's very much Tobit's thing, but yes, I suspect, Colin, you're bang on that they did use some inappropriate materials.
May I add a base to that? Do we know whether the medieval painters put some sort of wash to seal, in many cases it would be sandstone, or do they just use a whitewash? Or?
Yes, a great question again, Colin. Often the Pickering paintings are known as frescoes, and you'll see that term used a lot in the Victorian literature, but very few English medieval wall paintings are true frescoes. I recommend Roger Rosewell's book on medieval wall paintings. It has a lovely section on materials in it. Most of them are painted with earth and lake pigments directly onto a kind of lime wash.
Yes.
And of course, they were meant to breathe. They were meant to let the salts out, the mortar, And that's the problem, that as soon as you try and stop them breathing, you trap the damp behind that surface. And the Victorians simply didn't understand that. Or, many of the ecclesiologists obviously thought that you were supposed to see the bare surface of walls. And so, if you read the ecclesiologists, they were promoting this kind of substance called Manchester card. How do you pull the stucco and plaster off the wall of your church? And we've lost literally thousands of schemes of wall painting because of that, sadly.
Kate, what's the medium? Is it egg yolk? Is it water? Do we know?
Yes, a mixture, and often milk as well.
As well, yeah, right. Okay.
Jane, again, there's a nice discussion of those materials in Rosewell's volume, but yes, a mix of those. Obviously, it varied from group to group, and we don't, sadly, Pickering is not terribly well documented in terms of surviving records. There is one surviving record, one surviving will for 15th century Pickering, which just has this fragmentary reference to the guild in it, luckily, and then the whole document kind of is broken at that point. But we know there was the Guild of St Mary. We don't have any references to who the artists are, but we have to imagine this is the landscape of the great Cistercian monastic houses. Every single parish church, every great monastic building would have been full of these things. So it's probably the case that we have local groups of artists who are in constant business going around the churches and monastic buildings of North Yorkshire, painting these things.
A question from Sylvia. What is the name of your book?
Good question, Sylvia. Oh gosh. It's going to be published by Sean Tyas, who I'm sure some of you know, and it's something like Pickering Church Restoration, Conservation, Discovery, something like that. Sort of, it does what it says on the tin, basically. Yes. I wish I could think of fancy titles, but it will be
published now.
Not yet. I'm too busy recording Zoom lectures, Moira, and
yes.
I'm ignoring my publisher's requirements to finish my corrections. But hopefully later this year, maybe for our Yorkshire Churches Day.
Oh, brilliant.
Right, well, I think if we've got no more questions, we turn back to Tom to
I've got a question.
Vote of thanks.
Oh, Peter, sorry, Peter, yes.
Yes, I was interested in your comment about the text on one of the paintings, that it was evidence of literacy. Most discussions of literacy that I've read related to early printed Bibles, and I just wondered how your dates relate to the dates of early printed Bibles.
Well, yes, what a lovely question. As I mentioned, I think it's really interesting that, this is the period, the 1480s, the 1490s, of course, when Caxton's printed Bible comes out, but our paintings slightly precede that. But again, it's important, I'm sure many of you know here, that we have the great Robert Thornton living in North Yorkshire, only a stone's throw at East Newton Hall from Pickering. And he is one of the greatest scribes of medieval England, compiling Romance manuscripts, liturgical texts, devotional texts in these two great Thornton manuscripts, one at Lincoln Cathedral, one in the British Library. So if we think about this context, we have the libraries of the monastic houses. We have these aristocrats and gentry families who are reading and literate, but we also have a literate laity. We know from the analysis of other wills in this area that people have books of hours, devotional books in their libraries. Merchants, wealthy merchants and wealthy yeomen in the late 15th century are probably quite literate. And the stories of the saints, of course, would have been brought to life in the sermon exemplar in the Golden Legend. So if you haven't read the Golden Legend, it's a great read, and you get the story of the saint, and then you get all these exemplars of what happens to you if you doubt the saint. Something awful, it's not rocket science, something terrible is going to happen to you. And if you pray to the saint, all these wonderful things that are said to have happened to people. So that's how their stories were brought to life in the kind of weekly sermons. I wish the Reverend Ponsonby had thought about that. But intriguingly, in the 19th century, they have to explain those stories because people have forgotten them.
Another question from Vanessa, I think. Vanessa?
No, sorry, I think I saw Veronica. Did you have your hand up?
Well, I did, but Colin really asked the question that I was going to ask, and he asked it rather better. But as a sort of supplement to that, if you're cleaning these pictures with deionized water, is it cold or is it tepid? And what sort of applicator do you use?
As far as I'm aware from the work I observed at Stratford, it's cold. It's very careful. All the materials that are used are completely reversible these days. It's cotton buds, absolutely painstaking, which is why it is expensive.
Cotton buds over the whole extent of that church would take years.
Well, cotton wool. But it will take time. I mean, actually, when Jewett was repainting, it took 10 years. And they fundraised. It's fascinating looking at the newspapers. They had fancy bazaars. One of their bazaars in the 1870s, this was for the restoration of the church, raised £3,000. One fundraising event. That's pretty impressive. Mrs. Lightfoot was a force to reckon with, I think. So yes, it was a big program of work. And of course, for us in the lottery project, as you can imagine, we were trying to envisage a future where the young people of Pickering, elderly people in Pickering who remember Janet Lenton restoring the paintings, we had designed a special accessible scaffold so that disabled participants could go up the scaffold and maybe share in the cleaning of the paintings. That was one of the things that we wanted to really make sure that for a whole generation in Pickering, people really got to know and care for these paintings again. So I do really hope we will persuade the lottery that we're a good cause. So watch this space.
You're going to revisit that application, I hope, especially with all the things that people haven't been able to do in the last year. It would be a very worthy thing to do.
Yes, and with a new incumbent, one doesn't want to do anything before the new vicar arrives, but hopefully he'll be inspired by the Reverend Lightfoot. I know he has been, because he's been to a previous lecture and said, absolutely, I'm keen to do it. And we have wonderful colleagues there, the church wardens and fundraisers. So, but you all know, I'm sure many of you have done lottery projects, as I have here in Slingsby when we had our lead stolen. And it's one of the things that persuaded me to join the society. You generously, the Yorkshire Historic Churches Trust gave us a grant here to put the roof back on our church. That it's about bringing these stories to life for their local communities and ensuring that people care passionately about them by understanding their past. And to me, that's what lottery should be about. So fingers crossed.
Thank you.
Well, there are no more questions, I think. So over to Tom.
Well, I don't know about anybody else, but I've had the most wonderful hour. Kate, thank you so much. And I've loved your scholarship. I've enjoyed your intelligence. I've been amazed by your detective work, extraordinary detective work, and also at the bottom of it all, your intuition, which is leading us or has led us all for the last hour. So thank you very much, Kate. You set the bar terribly high for us. That was wonderful.
Absolutely right.
Give it up.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
See you all next month.
Yes, what I would just like to sort of finish by saying is that this is the beginning of 3 lectures, or the first one of 3 lectures. In a month's time, Jane Crease is going to talk to us about the alabaster tombs in Sheriff Hutton, and a month later, I think Mara is going to talk to us about tombs in Coxwell Church.
Yes.
Yeah. So keep your eyes on our website. We've also got, I think, we're going to be released from our purgatory and able to do events later on in the year. So we're going to be running 2 or 3 events, I hope, as well. But thank you all so much for coming. Don't forget, you can become friends of the Yorkshire Historic Churches Trust if you feel inclined. And Vanessa, if you get in a muddle with the website, I'm sure Vanessa would be delighted to help you. But thank you all so much, and we'll hopefully see you in a month's time.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Kate.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very, very, very much. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Moira.
Yes.
Thank you, Moira. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Kate, and everybody else.
Thank you, Veronica.
Thanks very much.
See you again.
See you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. I'll end the meeting now, shall I?
Okay, that's great. Yes, thank you. I did record
Yeah.
it, so hopefully I can get hold of your slides and then see if I can put it onto the website.
Yeah,
That'd be
lovely.
great.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.